BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello everybody, today is Wednesday, another Ripper Wednesday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Wednesdays this year, I've been talking to you guys about Jack the Ripper, perhaps the world's most famous unsolved mystery. And Jack the Ripper was a serial killer that operated in 1888. Whatever happened before or after that is still part of the mystery. And in this episode, I will be responding to the book, The London of Jack the Ripper by Richard Jones. And yes, this is Richard Jones of the Jack the Ripper Tour, YouTube channel, website, and of course the actual tour company. And Richard Jones has also covered several other subjects on the Jack the Ripper YouTube channel. I have always praised his video on the murder of Sweet Fanny Adams from 1867. But this is not going to be a traditional book review. Instead, it's going to be a book discussion where I'm just going to be pulling out some ideas from the early part of the book. That is, as you can see, this is part one, and I'm going to be responding to them. Now, Jack the Ripper committed a crime spree in 1888 that has just left the world in shock. But the book really begins in about 1885, talking about the years of 1885, 86, and 87, and it's discussing the conditions that people were living in and the very intense poverty that existed in Whitechapel. There was an enormous divide between the rich and the poor, and I'm paraphrasing this, but this is almost a direct quotation from the book when it says, "The sun never sets on the British Empire, but the sun never rises on the dark alleys of East London." And I think that that is a very straightforward explanation. But as previously stated, did Jack the Ripper just start killing people in 1888? Did he just start murdering people on August 31st of that year with the murder of Polly Nichols? Or were there preceding events that led up to the Ripper's crime that were committed by the same person, or are they influences? Because one of the things that is widely discussed about Jack the Ripper is, even though Whitechapel was experiencing very intense poverty, murder was not very common in Whitechapel. But the more that I read about Victorian England, it seems like murders definitely just happened a lot more frequently than people have originally thought. Or there are a lot of stories that are connected to the Ripper case where maybe it was the Ripper, maybe it wasn't, lots of unconfirmed victims, and I know it's still a small percentage of the population, and these are just a handful of stories that have been pulled out, but murder definitely seemed to have taken place. So was the Ripper operating earlier? And this is one, though, where I would like to begin by saying that Jack the Ripper is a serial killer mystery where there are very few clues. It's not like the Zodiac killer mystery where there are multiple witness sightings and they were able to draw a composite sketch of the killer. I mean, there is a wooden carving of what is said to have been Jack the Ripper, the composite that has been carved into a wooden cane, but I don't believe that that was the real Ripper. Instead, I actually think that that was a novelty cane that was sold around the time after the publishing of the book, The Curse Upon Mitre Square, and it's not even featuring a real person. It's featuring the Mad Monk character named Monk Martin from the book. I mean, I was presented with several different possibilities as to where the composite came from, and that's one that stood out to me more when they were talking about that in the news and such, and I think that that's the most likely explanation. But one of the clues about Jack the Ripper is, after the murder of Liz Stride, somebody shouted a particular word, and that word was Lipsky. And the book, The London of Jack the Ripper, talks a lot about a man named Israel Lipsky and the murder of a woman named Miriam Angel, which occurred in 1887. And to provide us with a little bit of assistance, I'm actually going to go over to casebook.org and look at an article that was written by Robert J. McLaughlin, just citing the source. Of all the witnesses in the Ripper case, Israel Schwartz is unique. That's Israel Schwartz, not Israel Lipsky, mind you. Israel Schwartz is unique. He's the only person to see any type of attack on a victim, and the only one to be confronted by a Ripper suspect. It wasn't a mutual confrontation. If the man who was assaulting Elizabeth Stride, Jack the Ripper's third victim, didn't shout Lipsky at Israel Schwartz, or if he misheard and was yelled at, and the second man didn't pursue him, then there was no confrontation at all. Yet this single word launched an immediate investigation to the Metropolitan Police, and they hoped that it would be a clue leading to the murder's identity. Schwartz's statement does not survive, but the details are given by Inspector Swanson in a report dated on October 19th of 1888. And so Israel Schwartz is, perhaps, I guess you'd say, one of the witnesses, even though there doesn't appear that anybody truly got a good look at the perpetrator. And in 1887, there was a man named Israel Lipsky who murdered a woman named Miriam Angel. And when I was reading the book, The London of Jack the Ripper by Richard Jones, it just talks about how it was a very horrible crime. Like, he murdered her by pouring nitric acid down her throat, and it just sounds like an absolutely sick and disgusting things. So I would like to go over to Richard's website, jacktherippertour.org, and this is talking about 11:45 a.m. on June 28th of 1887. Around 11:45 a.m. that day, a fellow lodger at Miriam Angel's guest house, Mrs. Lee Levy, arrived at the place of work to tell someone that something had happened to Miriam. At 10 o'clock that night, Mrs. Levy and Mrs. Leah Lipsky, the landlady of 16 Batty Street, had gone out to the market on Petticoat Lane and were gone for about an hour. When they returned, they had been greeted by Miriam Angel's mother-in-law, Dinah, who had come over to see her daughter-in-law, as she had not come around to her house for breakfast as she normally did. Dinah promptly headed upstairs and knocked on the doors of the room occupied by her son, Isaac Angel, and his wife. There was no reply. She therefore called to Leah Levy, who came upstairs and also tried the door, looking through the keyhole. Miriam Angel lay on the bed. Mrs. Levy hurried up to the next floor, where a small partition window afforded a view into the Angel's room. Looking through, she could not see if Miriam was truly on the bed, but she said she looked very bad. She was joined at the window by Mrs. Lipsky, who later recalled that she had seen Mrs. Angel on the bed and that she looked a little like fainting. The two women raced back downstairs, and together with Mrs. Angel, they forced the door open and entered the room. Leah Lipsky recounted what happened. Her mouth had a stream of yellow coming from the corner on the left-hand side. Her neck had 3 splashes, and her breast had a splash. Her hands were covered with stains of nitric acid. The yellow stains were nitric acid, commonly called aqua fortis. She was covered up to her breast with one of the German feather beds. I turned, this is a quotation, I turned down to see if any violence had been offered to her. Her chemise was pulled up to the breast, and the body was exposed. There was blood on the feather bed, splashes of blood and acid mixed together, and the effect of administering the stuff would cause a person to cough very violently. There were no marks of violence on the lower parts of the body, and there is the opinion that she had been dead for about 3 hours. And the ultimate conclusion of this is that she was murdered by a man named Israel Lipsky, and then Lipsky goes on to become a slur against Jewish people. This is one of the reasons why a lot of people believe that Jack the Ripper was Jewish, because of the word Lipsky being shouted after the murder of Liz Stride. So I think that, again, I've talked about this a lot, so I'll just be very brief. I'm not 100% sure that Jack the Ripper was Jewish. I'm not 100% sure that Jack the Ripper wasn't English, but it is definitely terrible what happened to Miriam Angel, and rest in peace to her. And that is really the extent of how and why Miriam Angel's murder took place in the book. There are not a lot of details. Maybe I'll have to do a larger episode on the murder of Miriam Angel and Israel Lipsky. But there is another one that is discussed in the early parts, and that is the murder of Annie Milwood. And the whole thing that Richard Jones is getting at in the book, The London of Jack the Ripper, is, did the Ripper actually start committing murders in August of 1888, or were they done before? Because there are preceding events that not only affected modern culture, but were there murders that took place that were the same killer? And this is a section about the murder of Annie Milwood. We will never be 100% certain who Jack the Ripper was. It follows that we will never know for sure the exact number of victims that he had. Although it is generally said that he had 5 victims, this figure may be way off the mark based on, as it is, on an awful lot of presumption and supposition. Quite possibly. The murders that we now know as Jack the Ripper's crimes come under the generic police file known as the Whitechapel murders. And this is, in fact, 11 crimes ranging in dates from April of 1888 to February of 1891. However, there were other crimes in the district earlier than 1888, and at least one of them has sometimes been put forward as a possible early work of Jack the Ripper, and that is Annie Milwood. She was 38 years old when she was murdered. She lodged in White's Row, just one street over from Dorset Street, where Mary Kelly, whom many consider to have been the last victim of Jack the Ripper, lived. Although Dorset Street no longer exists, White's Row does, and still contains several of its 18th century properties. On February 25th of 1888, Annie Milwood turned up at the Whitechapel Workhouse Infirmary with stab wounds on her stomach and legs. She told the staff that she had been attacked by a man who proceeded to inflict injuries on her with a clasp knife that he drew from his pocket. There were, it should be said, no witnesses to the attack, and at the time doubts were raised as to whether or not it had happened as she described, or whether the wounds were there for some other reason, maybe self-inflicted. Annie was subsequently transferred to the South Grove Workhouse, where some time later she was observed falling down whilst engaged in an activity near the rear of the building. When witnesses went to render assistance, they found her dead. The inquest was told that her death was not related in any way to the attack, and the injury found that she had died of natural causes. The reason her name sometimes appears as being an early crime by Jack the Ripper is that her attacker, if he did indeed exist, targeted her stomach and upper legs, much as the Ripper would do to the victims. So it's possible that Annie Milwood was not an actual murder victim of Jack the Ripper, but she may have well been one of his first attacks that evolved the modus operandi that would, by the end of the year, have made him notorious throughout the world. And I think what this article is going at is that, dying of natural causes, I think that it's very hard to say that someone would die of natural causes if they've been injured in a knife attack where the perpetrator is going after their legs and their upper body and they have real knife wounds. You'd have to expect that that could be connected in some way. We're talking about things like infection or things just like even if she's just going into shock or something like that. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot more to the story, and this would be another one that I would have to do a larger episode on for Black Box Online Radio, the death of Annie Milwood. But when you look at the Ripper's activities and behaviors, this is what they get into in the book, The London of Jack the Ripper. You can see escalations in criminality, escalations in viciousness. Let's say, hypothetically, if the murder of Annie Milwood was Jack the Ripper, somebody is attacking a woman, stabbing her, trying to cut her abdomen and her legs, and she survives for a period of time. Then, in August of 1888, you have the murder of Martha Tabram, where she is stabbed 39 times and left for dead. And then you have the murder of Polly Nichols on August 31st of 1888, and that's when the Ripper is truly beginning to operate. Now, from here on, it seems like the Ripper is definitely escalating the violence against women. The murders of Annie Chapman, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Kelly all show very vicious mutilations and very intense mutilations escalating in criminal behavior. We're talking about things like cutting out organs, removing the organs, possibly keeping them as trophies, and Mary Kelly, of course, had her face viciously mutilated. The one exception would be the murder of Liz Stride, because it is widely believed that the killer was interrupted before he could mutilate her. He killed her, he murdered her, but he was unable to mutilate her, and that just shows everything. If that is the same killer, if this is all one person, that means that it's not even about the murders, it's about the mutilations, that's the prime goal, because then roughly 15 minutes later, this person would have gone and found Catherine Eddowes with the ambition of mutilating her, of disemboweling her and cutting her body open and taking the certain body parts as trophies and possibly things that could be mailed in with future communications, such as the From Hell letter. But with the murder of Annie Milwood, you have first, somebody is attacking a woman, stabbing her. Then the woman is stabbed way more viciously in August of 1888, and then it goes to mutilating and disemboweling the women. So it makes sense. It makes sense. I've absolutely not seen enough evidence to say that I would certainly think that Annie Milwood was attacked by Jack the Ripper, and people were even doubtful and skeptical of her story. They thought that she was making up certain aspects of it. And But you can understand how sometimes criminals don't just start off the same way that they end up. They start out with a certain type of plan and then a certain amount of viciousness, and then the viciousness just escalates and escalates and escalates because they have to do things to fuel their own excitement. They have to do things to make it more intense for them. And also, they want to test the waters. They want to explore what's going to happen. Can they commit the crime this way and get away with it? Can they commit the crime that way and get away with it? And I mean, this is some stuff that's definitely worth thinking about. Some of the other things that are shared in the book, The London of Jack the Ripper, talk about the geographic areas in where the victims would have been living. And I was recently talking to you guys about the book Ripper Confidential by Tom Westcott, and he also points out that multiple victims of Jack the Ripper stayed in the lodging houses on George Street, the lodging houses of 18 George Street and 19 George Street. But something that Richard Jones shares in The London of Jack the Ripper is that there were an enormous amount of lodging houses, even in a specific area. There was a concentration of well over 140 lodging houses where people would have stayed. And I know that having multiple Ripper victims staying at 18 George Street and 19 George Street for a period of time not like they're all just living there and being murdered within the same time frame, but they had connections to those buildings. And Richard Jones just simply points out that there is a very large concentration of lodging houses in a particular area. So that also makes me kind of think that it's really not quite shocking that some of the Ripper victims would have stayed in the same ones, because they would go about them. They would go leave one and then stay in another one, and it's almost like a transient lifestyle. And I know it's not exactly a transient lifestyle, but it's a little bit similar. They're just moving from place to place whenever they have the money. In The London of Jack the Ripper as well, it's also stated that 3 of the women that I've been discussing were murdered because they didn't have the money for the lodging house. Martha Tabram, Polly Nichols, and Annie Chapman didn't have the money to pay the night's rent. They didn't have to pay the money for the lodging house, so they went out on the streets. With the murder of Martha Tabram, most people believe that she was using the tactic of trying to get drunk and passing out and falling asleep, and then that's when she was attacked, more or less blindsided, caught off guard, and stabbed when she was in a vulnerable place. So I think that there really is not a lot of evidence to me that the women were pre-chosen, and that the women of the Rippers, let's say victim list, were specific targets, because somebody just wrote into the channel saying that it's like, hey, you gotta give more credit to that theory that the women were specific targets and this is all done with a Masonic ritual. In the past, I immediately dismissed the observation that this had anything to do with the Masons, but the more that I explored the Masonic theory, the more I began to see the similarities and actually understand it. And that after the murder of Catherine Eddowes, something was written on a wall called the Goulston Street Graffito, and it said that the Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing, or something to that effect. And that is one where the word Jews is misspelled, and some people believe that it doesn't mean Jewish people, it means Jubala, Jubalo, and Jubalum from a Masonic story. They were the 3 ruffians that murdered the architect of King Solomon's temple, so then they were executed, and that the second one, Jubalo, had his intestines pulled out and thrown over the shoulder, and multiple Ripper victims, Annie Chapman and Catherine Eddowes, had their intestines pulled out and thrown over the shoulder, and I have to acknowledge the similarities. I mean, almost that the women were murdered as part of some type of Masonic ritual, and that they were specific targets, and there was a reason. It's possible. It's possible. And a lot of people believe that at least one of the Ripper victims was a specific target, and the others were murdered for different reasons. It's possible, but I'm just not convinced yet because of everything that I've just told you so far from The London of Jack the Ripper, just saying that, well, you're really not dealing with an area that is going to be that big. There are going to be connections, geographic connections to people. Just because someone is staying in the 18 George Street house and the 19 George Street house, it doesn't mean that they really had any real relationship or they did anything together or there was any type of personal connection to somebody else. in all reality, it's just an area of the city, and there are people walking up and down the same streets. End of story. So I have to play the skeptical card, but I do give some credit to this theory involving the Masons, and I'm going to be exploring it more in the future. But this is just part one of the book, The London of Jack the Ripper by Richard Jones, and I've been pulling in from some other sources, but that's one thing that I have the ability to do on Ripper Wednesday. So please stay tuned for part two, which will come out next week on Ripper Wednesday, and if you like this episode, you can hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. You can also go through some of the links in the description box. And one of them is for BuyMeACoffee.com. BuyMeACoffee.com/BlackBoxNet88 allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show. And anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. And that's all for me now. I will see you guys over on Cooper Friday talking about D.B. Cooper. Until next time.